The tear was perfect. Round like a dewdrop, it slid slowly down the girl's cheek, refracting the light streaming through the hallway window. Maya was 9 years old, but her eyes held that gravity that only children forced to grow up too fast seem to develop. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the tear with the corner of the white handkerchief pinned to her modest school uniform. The handkerchief was clean, well cared for, the kind a mother washes by hand because a washing machine is a luxury she can't afford. She was hiding behind a large Chinese porcelain vase, the kind that costs more than the entire house she lived in. Her eyes were fixed on something distant, something happening inside that luxurious study. There was a pain in that look that didn't match her age. It was a pain she had inherited from her mother, who had inherited it from someone before her. That pain that runs through generations of women who work too hard and get paid too little. The camera of her vision moved slowly, revealing the man she was watching. Edward Sterling, multimillionaire, owner of half a dozen skyscrapers in the city. He was sitting at his solid mahogany desk, head down, shoulders hunched as if someone were pushing them down with force. He made no noise, just trembling at irregular intervals, that kind of silent weeping that is even more devastating because it doesn't ask for permission to exist. There was a letter in his hand, crumpled, destroyed by the force of his grip. The ink was running from sweat and tears. Maya couldn't read the words, but she could read the language of despair. She could read it because she was fluent in it. Suddenly, Edward turned. There was no warning, just movement. His eyes, red and swollen, met hers behind the vase. Shock crossed his face like lightning. For an eternal second, the father and the accidental adopted daughter of circumstance stared at each other. He, seeing a child who shouldn't be there. She, seeing a man who shouldn't be broken. His expression wasn't one of anger. It was total vulnerability. It was the look of a man who had been discovered at his worst moment and didn't have the energy to pretend everything was okay. Edward took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a few seconds. When he opened them again, his composure had returned, that shell of professionalism that rich men learn to wear like armor. He stood up slowly, as if every movement were a conscious decision. He walked toward Maya with measured, controlled steps, the kind of steps executives use in board meetings. He crouched down until he was at eye level with her. The girl flinched. Her entire body tensed up, that reflex children develop when they expect to be punished for seeing things they weren't supposed to see. But Edward didn't scold her. His voice, when it came out, was raspy, the rasp of someone who had spent hours screaming silently. "Why did you do that?" The question was stripped of judgment. It was just curiosity, and curiosity coming from a place so human that Maya managed to relax her shoulders slightly. "Because you look just like my mom when she cries alone," Maya whispered, the words coming out like a confessed secret, as if she were admitting something that could hurt her if said out loud. The sentence hit Edward physically. He blinked several times, his hand raised as if he wanted to reach for the girl's face, but then lowered again, as if he understood he didn't have the right to that gesture. "My mom works a lot," Maya continued, her words coming in a flow she couldn't control. "She cries when she thinks I'm asleep. She cries in the kitchen after cleaning the house. She cries alone because she doesn't want me to see." Edward sat on the hallway floor, next to that porcelain vase that was worth more than the entire life of Claire, Maya's mother. He said nothing. He just allowed that 9-year-old girl to watch him while he put himself back together, while he gathered the pieces of himself he had let fall. That afternoon, that very afternoon when Edward's lungs still trembled with the sobs he had suppressed, he did something he had never done in 20 years of ownership. He asked to walk Maya to her home. The home was a single room at the back of the estate, originally a carriage house. There was a mattress in one corner, a small hot plate that worked sometimes, and a window that looked out onto the concrete wall of the neighboring property. But there were flowers in aluminum cans that Claire had tended to. There were clean towels hung with precision. There was, in every inch of that impossible space, the evidence of a woman who refused to live in filth, even if her life felt like filth itself. Claire was out, working somewhere else, cleaning from mansion to mansion, earning wages that disappeared into bills that never ended. Her daughter, at an age when she should have been playing, was organizing the precious few things she owned, hanging clothes on a nail in the wall, studying in a notebook while eating bread and water. Edward stood in the doorway of that room for over an hour. He didn't speak much, he just observed. And for the first time in years, he saw. He didn't see as a boss sees an employee, like someone checking if the job was done well and then forgetting. He saw as a man who understands that entire universes are occurring in places he had never paid attention to. When he left, Maya walked him to the gate of their small enclosure. She reached out and placed her hand in his. That hand was small, fragile, but there was strength in it. There was the strength of someone who understands that kindness is an act of resistance. Back in the mansion, Edward went up to his office. The photo of his daughter was still there, on the desk. Lara, 23 years old, with her whole life ahead of her, with all the privileges in the world. And yet, lying in a hospital bed, breathing with the help of machines, her brain shut down, her eyes closed for months. He looked at the photo. Then he looked at the window overlooking the back of the property, where Maya and her mother lived in a space that had less square footage than his walk-in closet. Something moved inside Edward, something that had been so buried under layers of money and self-pity that he had forgotten it was there. That thing was called conscience, and it doesn't whisper, it screams. He picked up his phone. His hands shook as he dialed. The phone rang twice before his lawyer answered. "Richard, it's me. I need to revise my will. Now, I need to make some major changes." Edward spent that night awake, not sleeping, not thinking clearly, just feeling. And in that darkness of his millionaire's bedroom, he finally understood that he had spent his entire life building a fortress when what he really needed was to learn how to tear down the walls. Edward waited 3 days. 3 days that felt like 3 months. He didn't sleep. He just paced the mansion, that space that now felt like a mausoleum, passing Lara's photo, passing the window that looked out to the room in the back, waiting for the right moment to do what he had decided the night before. On the 3rd day, he sent for Claire, not brutally, just a message passed by his assistant. Mr. Sterling would like to speak with her in the study when she had a moment. Claire went up to that study like someone walking to the gallows. She knew these rooms only to clean them, never to be inside them as a guest. Her maid's uniform was still stained with dust from a previous task. She had tried to clean herself up quickly, but there wasn't enough time in the world to remove that hierarchy that lived embedded in her skin. Edward watched her enter. He saw the way she kept her hands slightly clasped, as if she didn't know where to put them. He saw how her eyes swept the room, measuring the space, a space that was bigger than her entire house. "Claire, thank you for coming," Edward began, his voice trying to be gentle but coming out formal. He felt uncomfortable in his own power, and that discomfort made him sound even more authoritative. "I've spoken with the directors of a private preparatory academy. I'm talking about the best school in the city. I thought it would be good for Maya. Education is fundamental to—" "No, sir," Claire interrupted. Her voice was low, but there was iron in it. Edward blinked. Nobody interrupted Edward. Nobody refused Edward. "Excuse me? I don't want you to pay for my daughter's school." The words came out like a sentence. Simple, direct, destructive. Edward leaned back in his chair. He had expected gratitude. He had prepared a speech about opportunities, about transforming lives through education. He had mentally practiced how this would make Maya smile, how this would make him feel like he was doing a good thing, finally. "Why not?" he asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. "Because my daughter is not a social cause, sir. She is not a charity you pick up when you're feeling generous. She is everything I have. And if you put her in a school where the kids have everything she doesn't, where she is the poor girl among the children of the rich, you aren't helping. You are breaking her." Claire took a deep breath. Her hands had unclasped, finding rest at her sides. "Maya studies at night at a public school. She gets good grades. She is smart. What she isn't is deaf, and she isn't blind. If you put her in a place where she feels eternally in debt, eternally inadequate, you will destroy the girl she is to create a broken version of her that feels grateful." Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no answer he could construct that didn't sound small and arrogant. "My daughter doesn't need your pity, sir. My daughter needs dignity, and dignity cannot be bought." She left the office, leaving silence behind her, that silence that is louder than any scream. Edward ordered books the next day. Not textbooks, not like someone trying to improve a child. Just books, fairy tales, fantasies, stories of girls who traveled through impossible worlds. He waited for Maya to pass by the library and left the books there, as if they were an offering to the gods. Maya took them. She accepted them as children accept gifts, with that mix of childish joy and caution that comes from learning early on that nothing is free. But a week later, she returned something, a drawing. It was done on newsprint, but the quality of the work was impressive for a 9-year-old. There was perspective, there was depth, there was shadow and light built with just a pencil. The drawing showed Edward. He was sitting in a gigantic room, that empty white room that seemed to have no end. He was alone, completely alone. His figure was small relative to the space around him, as if that emptiness was much bigger than any amount of wealth could fill. And underneath, in childish handwriting, but with a precision that was almost cruel, it was written, "The richest man in the world." Edward held the drawing for a long time. It wasn't a critique, it wasn't judgment, it was just observation. It was a child seeing a man with more clarity than any adult could ever manage. He placed the drawing on his desk, next to Lara's photo, and he stood there looking at that image of himself, alone in that white, infinite room, until his vision began to blur. The phone rang in the middle of the night. It was 2 a.m. The voice of the hospital doctor was professional, but there was something behind that professionalism that was desperation. "Mr. Sterling, I'm calling about your daughter. Her condition has worsened significantly in the last 12 hours. The cerebral edema is increasing. Without intervention, we have weeks, maybe days." Edward sat up in bed. He had slept better since that night he discovered Maya behind the vase, but the sleep had been shallow, consciousness always nearby. "What do you suggest?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "There is an experimental procedure performed in only 3 research centers in the world. The success rate is low, very low, maybe 15%. But without it, there is no hope at all." "How much does it cost?" $400,000. And that's just the procedure. The hospitalization, recovery, post-op meds, you're looking at something close to $500,000. Edward had $500,000. In fact, he had much more than $500,000. But hearing that number that would cost a 15% chance, that number that might not save his daughter but only keep her in a coma a little longer, that number hit him in a way nothing had hit him before. Because in that moment, he understood something his wealth had never been able to buy: the impossibility of controlling the outcome. "I'll wire the money tomorrow," he said. "Do the procedure." When he hung up the phone, he looked at the window overlooking the back of the property. It was still night, but he knew that in a few hours Claire would wake up. She would leave that room, she would go to work, and she would continue living that life that was anything but easy, with a daughter who had everything except opportunity. And he would continue here, in this mansion, with a daughter who had everything except life. And no amount of money could fix either of the two situations. Edward picked up Maya's drawing again. He looked at that white, infinite room. And for the first time in his life, he understood that he had been living in a very similar version of that room. Only in place of the emptiness, there was money. And in place of the loneliness, there was the isolation that money buys. That night, while he waited for morning, while he waited for news from the hospital, while he waited for anything that could solve this impossible situation, Edward just stayed awake, holding a drawing made by a girl who had understood his life better than he ever could. And somewhere in that mansion, in some room in the back, Claire slept beside Maya, those two women who had each other and had dignity. and Edward understood that might be more than any amount of money could ever offer. The experimental treatment would happen in 3 weeks. 3 weeks that Edward turned into an obsession that consumed every cell of his body. He studied medical journals he didn't fully understand. He called the hospital 10 times a day. He consulted experts on comas, on neurology, on anything that could offer that magic number he needed, a chance greater than 0. His mind had narrowed. Now there was only one thing in that universe: saving Lara. Everything else was noise. Everything else was distraction. Claire stayed at the mansion longer than her schedule allowed. Edward had started asking for bigger favors, more cleaning in Lara's rooms, as if that space needed to be perfect for when she woke up. More meal prep for food he didn't eat. More tasks that kept her busy, away from her room, away from Maya. The girl noticed. Of course she noticed. Maya was that kind of child who saw everything, who absorbed everything, who understood the weight of things no one else could articulate. And so she started leaving small gifts. On the first day, there was a flower. Just a single flower, those wild flowers that grew in the forgotten corners of the estate. It was placed at the door of Edward's office in a glass of water. When he saw it, he didn't understand immediately. He just observed it for a few seconds before continuing with his day. On the second day, there was a cookie, homemade. You could tell by the uneven shape, by the slightly burnt edges. Maya had made it with her own hands while her mother worked. She had baked it on an old hot plate that half worked, and she had left it there, hopeful, silent. Edward ate that cookie. He ate it and felt something break inside him, but he didn't stop to examine it. There was no time to examine anything. The gifts continued. An old coin Maya had found, a drawing of Lara based on photographs but done with all the childish precision she could offer. A note in careful handwriting. For when she wakes up, so she knows there was someone here thinking of her. Edward placed each item on his desk, but he didn't allow it to truly touch him. There was a wall he had built, and that wall was made of urgency, of fear, of the need to control something that was completely out of his control. Edward's sister showed up on a Tuesday without warning. Margaret. She was the sister who had been waiting years for their mother's death to inherit the bulk of the estate. She was the sister who had disappeared when Lara had her accident, but who reappeared now like a vulture, worried that Edward was spending too much on that useless treatment that would lead nowhere. She was walking through the hallways of the mansion when she saw Maya coming out of the office. The girl had just left a gift, a small notebook where she had drawn every season of the year. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Where are you going with that?" she asked, pointing to the notebook in Maya's hands. I was leaving a gift for Mr. Sterling," Maya answered, her voice small. "A gift? A poor child? A maid's daughter? Leaving gifts in a rich man's office? That doesn't sound like theft to you?" Maya froze, her face went pale. "No, I didn't steal anything. You made it? You made it with what? With whose supplies? With whose paper? Everything here belongs to my brother. So technically you stole my brother's supplies to make these gifts." Claire was in the hallway. She had heard. Her entire body had tensed up, that tension that comes from absolute maternal protection, from that will to throw oneself in front of a car if necessary. "My daughter is not a thief," Claire said, her voice low but cutting. "Your daughter is always in places she shouldn't be, always having access to things she shouldn't have. I want her out of this house." "Today," Edward heard from his office. He stepped out, his expression confused, as if waking from a very deep dream. "What is going on here?" Margaret turned to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Brother, I think you should know that your maid and her daughter have been stealing things. Supplies, access, trust. This is quite serious, especially considering you are spending a fortune on Lara while allowing people like this to exploit your property." Edward looked at Maya, looked at Claire, looked at Margaret, and in that moment he saw the situation with terrible clarity. Defending them meant defending them. It meant admitting he had allowed that girl access to his office. It meant explaining why. It meant opening that Pandora's box about his feelings, his loneliness, his guilt for not having been present for anyone. It meant looking weak. It meant looking like less than a successful man. So he hesitated, just for a few seconds, just the time of a breath. But that hesitation was enough for Maya to understand everything. The girl, who had remained silent until then, took a deep breath and screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of pain. It was the scream of a child who had tried to reach a lonely adult and had been rejected at the moment it mattered most. I didn't steal anything. I just wanted him to stop suffering alone. The words exploded in the room like shattered glass. Maya was crying now, all that precocious childhood control vanishing, leaving only a child who had loved someone it wasn't her responsibility to love. Claire pulled her daughter close, her hands trembling. "Enough," she said to Edward. "We're leaving. Today. I'll figure out my life, I'll get my daughter out of here, but we are not staying in a place where you let us be accused without defense." Edward raised his hand. "Wait." "No," Claire replied. "You waited the whole time. You waited when your daughter cried alone while you studied your work. You waited when your daughter tried to comfort you. You waited just now. No more." She led Maya out of the room. Margaret remained, with that smile that never faded. "Well, that was dramatic," she said. "She was right, you know. You really should focus on Lara. Letting people like that exploit your property is irresponsible." Edward looked at her. And in that moment he saw that woman with clarity for the first time. He saw the greed. He saw the lack of compassion. He saw someone who had come there only to confirm that her brother was becoming weak, so she could justify taking more things from him. "Get out of my house," he said. His voice was calm, but there was depth in it. "Excuse me? Get out, now!" Margaret left, confused, muttering something about bad behavior and inheritance. Edward closed the door to his office. The silence that remained was different from the silence before. Before, it had been empty. Now, it was the active absence of something that had been present. He looked at his desk, at the flower, at the cookie he had eaten days ago, which had left crumbs on a plate, at the sketchbook, at the drawing Maya had made months earlier, that white, infinite room where he was alone. For the first time, he understood that that drawing wasn't a critique. It was a cry for help from a child who had seen a man dying of loneliness and had tried to save him the only way she knew how. Offering presence. His phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mr. Sterling, it's Dr. Roberts. We need to discuss the final decision regarding the procedure. The latest MRIs show that the chances of success have dropped to 5%. Only 5%. Edward closed his eyes. 5%, he repeated. "Yes, we are still willing to do it, if you authorize. But I think you should understand what we are talking about. 95% chance of death in the operating room. And if, by some miracle, she survives that, there is a significant possibility she will never wake up." Edward took a deep breath. In that moment, holding that phone, seeing that drawing of a white, infinite room, understanding that he had just let the only person who had tried to pull him out of that room walk out the door, he finally understood that he had reached a choice that no amount of money could make easier. A daughter with a 5% chance. A girl and her mother he had just lost, and no choice that would make him less lost in the end. Edward couldn't sleep that night. He walked through the mansion like a ghost, passing rooms he hadn't visited in months. Entire living rooms he had left behind when his mind narrowed to just one purpose. At some point, near 3 in the morning, he arrived at Lara's room. That room that had remained untouched since the day of the accident. There were her photo albums on a shelf, those paper books her mother had insisted she keep when everything started going digital. Books Lara had curated personally, organizing her memories with the precision of someone who understands that the most valuable things are the ones you can hold. Edward pulled down one of those albums, the one from 10 years ago. When Lara was just 13 and had decided, for reasons he had never really asked, that she wanted to volunteer at a community daycare. He had supported it only vaguely. He had signed the authorization form. He had driven her there a few times. But he had always been too busy with his business to really follow what his daughter was doing with her time. He opened the album. There were pages and pages of teenage Lara, smiling, surrounded by small children. There were moments of authenticity he had never seen in later photos. No selfies or poses for the camera, just joy. And then, he saw the photo. Lara was holding a baby in her lap, a baby maybe a year old. Lara was laughing for real, in a way that lit up her whole face. The baby had one of those toothless smiles only babies can manage. But it was what was in the background that froze Edward. A young woman, much younger than now, but with that face he had begun to know in recent months. Claire, much younger, but with that same way of caring, that same look of protection. Edward flipped the following pages with trembling fingers. There were more photos. Lara playing at the daycare, Lara reading stories, Lara giving kids baths. And in every one of them, frequently in the background or a little to the side, was Claire. He left Lara's room still holding that album. He went down to his office, opened his computer, searched for old records, searched for information about that daycare, searched for the name. Hope Community Center, operated from 2013 to 2015. There were photos of the institution in a local paper. There was an article about volunteers, and there, in a group photo, was Lara. There, in a second staff photo, was Claire, much younger, with a different name on her uniform. Her maiden name, perhaps. Edward searched for the date. From 2013 to 2015. Maya was born in 2016. That was the era when Lara had been a volunteer. That was the time. He left his office and went to the kitchen. Claire was there even at that impossible hour of the morning. She had stayed. Despite everything, she had stayed, maybe thinking Maya would still need this job, this safe place. She stood up when she saw him, her expression shifting to immediate defense. "Mr. Sterling, The daycare," he interrupted. "Hope Community Center. You worked there?" Claire blinked. Her face went pale. "Yes," she answered slowly. "Many years ago." "And Lara, my daughter Lara, she was a volunteer there?" Claire lowered her eyes. "Yes, she was. She was very good with the children, very kind. She took special care of Maya when she was small. When my daughter was just a few months old." Edward sat in one of the kitchen chairs. He was processing. He was seeing the connections form in his mind like a puzzle he had been looking at wrong his whole life. "Why did you never say anything?" Claire took a deep breath. Her hands gripped a towel she had been holding. "Because when Lara had her accident, the daycare closed. I looked for work in many places. But when I heard you were looking for a housekeeper, I couldn't refuse. Because Lara had done so much for my daughter. She gave her attention when my daughter had nothing else. She taught her there were good people in the world. And when she disappeared like that, so suddenly, Claire paused. Her hands shook. "I thought if I could work here, if I could take care of the place where Lara lived, if I could take care of you, it would be a way to give back." Edward stood up. He walked to the window overlooking the shack in the back, that room where Claire and Maya lived. "Maya," he said. "Does she know?" "No, she was very little. Maybe she has a vague memory, but nothing conscious. And I didn't want her to feel tied to the past, to a person who couldn't be here." Edward turned around. Those drawings she left, the gifts. "Was she taking care of you because of Lara?" "No," Claire answered quietly. "She was taking care of you because you were suffering. Because Maya sees other people suffering and can't simply turn the other way. But yes, it was also because without knowing it, she was trying to take care of someone who had been good to her mother." Edward sat down again. The album was on the kitchen table. He pulled it closer, looked at the photo of teenage Lara smiling, hugging a baby. Lara was a volunteer. She chose to be there. She chose to take care of Maya. "Yes," Claire answered softly. "She was that kind of person. Edward sat in silence for a long time, looking at the photo, then looking at the window facing the shack, then at the clock on the wall. It was 4 a.m. In a few hours, he would have to call the hospital. He would have to make a decision about that procedure with the 5% chance. But in that moment, holding that album, understanding that his daughter had been good to a girl because she was the kind of person who is good, understanding that that girl, years later, had come to him and tried to be good to him in return, Edward finally understood what Lara had known 10 years ago. That love is not a transaction. That kindness demands no return. That sometimes you do good for someone and go years without knowing that action changed that person's entire life. He looked at Claire. "If I do the procedure," he said slowly, "Lara has a 5% chance. 5% chance to wake up, to live, to know Maya properly, to know that the baby she loved grew up and became a girl who took care of her father." "Yes," Claire answered. 5%. "And if I don't? Then in a few weeks, a few days maybe, Lara will go, and that opportunity disappears." Edward held that photo of teenage Lara, held that image of his daughter being good for the sake of being good, without knowing she was changing the course of an entire life. "Then I'm going to do it," he said. "I'm going to do the procedure. Not because I have rational hope it will work, but because Lara taught me without even realizing it, that sometimes love isn't about the odds. It's about standing in the dark waiting for the miracle to arrive." He took a deep breath. "And Claire, I want Maya to know. I want her to know Lara was important to her. I want that when Lara wakes up, when she wakes up, she can properly meet the girl she loved." Claire began to cry, that kind of crying that is relief and hope and fear all mixed together. "Do you think she'll wake up?" she asked. "I don't know," Edward answered honestly. "But now I know why she should. Because there is a girl out there who needs to know that the kindness you offer comes back to you in ways you can never imagine." He looked at the window, at that shack, at that girl who had entered his life through compassion and stayed through love. "Now I need to apologize," Edward said. "I need to bring her back. I need her to know we want her, that Lara loves her, that this is real." And in that break of day in a mansion kitchen, Edward finally understood that the miracle he was waiting for might not be Lara waking up. Maybe it was simply learning to live again. The hospital smelled of death and hope in equal measure. Edward walked down the corridors that Monday morning, Lara's album under his arm, as if those photographs could serve as currency with the universe. Dr. Roberts was waiting for him in the conference room. There were charts on the wall. There were numbers that meant everything and nothing simultaneously. "So," the doctor began, "have you made a decision about the procedure?" Edward sat down. His hand trembled slightly, but he steadied it. He had spent the entire night with that album, looking at the photo of teenage Lara, seeing in every image the person she had chosen to be. Kind, present, alive in a way that transcended any amount of assisted breathing. "Yes," Edward replied. "I am not going to do the procedure." The doctor blinked. He had expected the opposite answer. "Are you sure? There is still a 5% chance. 5% chance of surviving the surgery," Edward interrupted. "And maybe 95% chance she remains in a coma, suffering, trapped in a body that isn't here anymore. I'm not going to do that to her. Lara was a person who understood dignity, who understood what it means to be alive. I am going to honor that." The doctor took a deep breath. There was relief on his face, the relief of a professional who had been waiting for his patient to finally make the choice compassion demanded. "Then we will move to palliative care. Total comfort. She won't suffer, she will go in peace." "Yes," Edward answered. "And I want to be here. I want to be here when it happens." Lara died 3 days later. She didn't wake up. She never woke up to meet Claire's daughter. She never woke up to know she had changed a life 10 years ago, and that that life had returned to take care of her father. But when she left in peace, in a room Edward had filled with flowers. Flowers Maya had helped choose, Flowers Maya had placed with her own hands, whispering thank yous to the person who had been good to her mother. Edward stayed there while the nurse disconnected the machines. He stayed there while the silence took over. That different silence that is the silence of a body that has finally stopped fighting. He held Lara's hand and whispered promises she would never hear, but that he would know he had made. A week later, Edward gathered his family in the mansion's living room. Margaret was there. His uncles were there. Those relatives who had disappeared when money was just an idea and reappeared now. Those relatives who were already mentally calculating how much they would inherit. Claire was also there. And Maya. The girl was wearing that modest school uniform, her eyes red from crying but her spine straight. She shouldn't be there. Not at a family gathering, but Edward had insisted. "I gathered you here," Edward began, his voice calm but with the weight of iron behind it, "to inform you of some major changes to my plans. My daughter Lara passed away a week ago. She was a person who understood something most of us spend a lifetime trying to learn, the meaning of being present." He paused. His eyes met Claire's, then Maya's. Lara volunteered at a community center. She took care of children she had no obligation to care for. She offered her kindness simply because she understood that was what the world needed. And one of those children was Maya. Margaret started to open her mouth, but Edward raised a hand. "Let me finish. I spent my life accumulating wealth, building properties, expanding businesses, and in the end, I discovered I had lost the most valuable thing we have: time with the people we love. Lara understood this at 13. It took me 45 years to learn." Edward walked over to Claire and Maya. He put a hand on each of their shoulders. "Starting today, I am transforming this estate into a shelter and education center for underprivileged children. Claire will be the director of operations. Maya will have her full education guaranteed at the school of her choice. And my fortune, after some defined donations, will be destined for the Lara and Maya Foundation. A foundation dedicated to honoring my daughter's memory through the care of children who have no one." Margaret stood up, her face red with anger. "You can't be serious. This is emotional cowardice. You are leaving a fortune to a maid and her daughter because of feelings?" "No," Edward replied, his eyes meeting hers with absolute clarity. "I am leaving my fortune to honor my daughter, who was a better person than anyone in this room, and I am leaving it because I finally understood that no one should inherit money simply because they share blood. You will inherit enough to live comfortably, but the rest goes to people who will turn it into something bigger than numbers in an account." "You are disinheriting us," Edward's uncle said, his voice in shock. "I am disinheriting greed. If that is you, then yes." Margaret left the room, her footsteps echoing through the mansion like a sentence. The other relatives followed her, muttering resentments Edward had ceased listening to years ago. In the silence that remained, Edward turned to Claire and Maya. "You are my family now," he said, "if you want to be." Maya ran to hug him, that girl who had cried behind a vase, who had left flowers and cookies, who had tried to comfort a man who was a stranger. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She was his daughter in the same way Lara was. Different, but equally valuable, equally loved. Claire remained motionless for a few seconds. Then she walked to Edward and hugged him too. That woman who had worked 16 hours a day to offer dignity to her daughter, who had accepted a job in silence to return a favor done years ago. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing us." "Thank you for coming," Edward replied. "Lara sent you. I was just a man too slow to understand." 1 year later, the mansion had been transformed. The marble walls now had bright colors, murals painted by local artists. The garden where there had only been luxury plants now had a playground. There were swings that children used, a slide that squeaked, a sandbox where small hands built castles. Edward was in the library, the one that had been his private study, reading a story to a group of children. 7 of them, ages between 5 and 8. All of them had come from nothing, from abandonment, from the loneliness the city offered to the children nobody wanted. He read with his narrator voice, That voice he had learned through Maya. That voice that tells stories not like someone instructing, but like someone inviting you into a better world. And so, he continued, the princess understood she didn't need to be saved. She just needed someone to believe in her. The children were locked into the story. One of them, a 7-year-old girl with scars of abuse on her arms, was sitting on the arm of Edward's chair, completely absorbed in that fantasy world. When the story ended, there were sighs of contentment. That kind of contentment only children who finally feel safe can produce. "One more time?" a child asked. "Tomorrow," Edward answered, his voice gentle. "Today we have a special activity." He stood up. Maya was waiting at the door, her new school uniform still looking impossible on someone who a few months ago wore mended clothes. She had passed the admission exam. She had chosen a top-tier academy, and Edward had insisted she have everything she needed to thrive. "Let's plant," Maya said, that girl who was now 10 years old and had a confidence she hadn't possessed before. They took the children to the garden. Claire was there, supervising everything, that woman who had become the director of a place that had transformed her life. She had hired teachers, she had hired psychologists, she had created a space where children who had known only rejection could learn there was something called belonging. In the corner of the garden under the oldest oak tree on the property, Edward and Maya dug a hole. "Here?" Maya asked. "Here," Edward confirmed. They placed a sapling, a small fragile thing with green leaves and hope in its roots. When they finished, Edward kneeled and inserted a bronze plaque into the soil. The plaque read, "In memory of Lara, who taught us to see each other." Edward placed his hand in Maya's hand, and they watched as the other children, one by one, placed a handful of dirt around that tree, sealing their commitment to that space, to that future. "Do you think she knows?" Maya asked, her voice small but sure. "Yes," Edward answered. "Lara always knows." And in that moment, with the hand of a girl who had tried to comfort him when he was a stranger, Edward finally understood that he hadn't lost his daughter. He had simply understood that family isn't blood. Family is the choice you make every day to be present, to offer compassion, to transform pain into purpose. The tree would grow. The children would grow. The mansion would continue to be a place where loneliness was transformed into belonging. And somewhere, in that place we cannot see but know exists, Lara was smiling. Because finally her father had learned what she had tried to teach from the beginning. That being alive isn't about how much you have, it's about how much you offer. This story taught us that true wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we choose to share. That compassion isn't weakness, it's the most powerful force there is. That sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of what we love and transforming that pain into purpose for others. If you like emotional stories like this, stories that remind us that we are more human when we choose to see each other, subscribe to the channel to become part of our family. Because here we tell stories about people who learn to love.